The blissful silence around him began to wane as the ringing in his ears dragged him back from the depths of unconsciousness. Groaning, he slowly adjusted his arms forward in an effort to push himself up from the piles of cold snow which had shaped themselves around his inert form. Feeling something metal hit his right arm as he moved it, he searched that region with his hand and managed to scoop up the slightly buried B-3 wingman he'd dropped. He could hear the signature sound of static as the comm link in his helmet tried to re-establish a signal. After a few seconds, he heard a voice cut in. "Move! I repeat, the mission is scrubbed. All forces get to the evac point." Dizzily, Tobias stood himself up properly as his head continued to reel from the concussive force of the grenade which had knocked him out earlier. His vision was bleary, though he was able to maintain enough focus to see where he was heading. A nav point appeared on his HUD, and he staggered his way through the powder towards it. "Where's 4? Did he make it?" He heard the familiar voice of Jospert call out the question to the others aboard the dropship, and he quickly opened up the channel on his end. "I've got a few new bruises, but I'm alright. Heading to the LZ now." Jospert gave a sigh of relief. "Good to hear. I lost CO, was hoping I didn't lose you too." Tobias winced at the news, fully aware of how close his friend was to his Titan. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jospert." "Good news is that he took a lot of these militia bastards with him. We're fairly certain we cleaned the settlement out. Sergeant, we have a bogey closing in on the LZ." He was only a few hundred feet away now, well within the line of sight of the dropship, when he saw an ogre model Titan barreling out of cover from the trees that surrounded the cliff over which the ship was hovering. He could see that it had sustained heavy damage, bore the colors of the militia, and was emitting a high-pitched whine in conjunction with a steadily increasing glow coming from its chest. "Shit," he heard Jospert call. "Pull away! Pull!" Tobias barely had time to throw himself to the ground before the Titan's nuclear core detonated. In an instant, the LZ was enveloped in a blaze of fire and compressed radioactive energy. After a moment, he raised his head and was rewarded with a view of the blossoming explosion that had once been the extraction ship. He found himself frozen in horror as he saw chunks of metal and bodies fly in every which way, snow and ash now indistinguishable from one another as they both drifted through the air. With a loud crunch, the skeleton of the ship landed in a heap upon the precipice of the cliff, and creaked loudly against the rocks as it slowly fell over the edge. Nothing of the Titan had survived, as it had been vaporized entirely by the blast. No sign remained of its existence other than the scorched dirt it left behind. He laid there in shock, immobile. It was some time before he shakily rose from the ground and looked out at the scene of destruction around him. Not just the explosion site, but at the carnage which had led to it. Bodies of riflemen, pilots, and Titans alike lay scattered about and frozen in death, much like the surface of this world. He switched his comm link to broadcast openly, hoping there was someone listening. "IMS Kraken Control, this is PFC Tobias 4. The exfil dropship was destroyed. I am the only survivor. I require extraction. Over." There was no response. He looked up in despair at the dark sky, knowing that any chance of a signal reaching someone through the bad weather was slim at best. "IMS Kraken Control. How copy? Over." Again, there was no answer save for the crackle of static in his ear. He knew what this meant. He might as well have already been dead. He was stuck here, alone in this godforsaken winter landscape with nothing but dead trees and white powder for company. Control was likely under the impression that there were no survivors, considering the exfiltration had failed magnificently. As far as they knew, he'd died along with them. If he was going to survive, he needed to maintain a level head. He thought about his options, and looked every which way for some sign of shelter that he could take cover in. Obviously, the militia had some kind of outpost out here. They hadn't come across it in the initial skirmish, but these forces hadn't just popped out of thin air. He had to find that outpost and take refuge. His armor could only compensate for so much. If he was out here still by nightfall, the freezing conditions would kill him. He waded through the graveyard of corpses, marching over to where they'd first spotted the enemy as they emerged from the trees nearby. Analyzing the general direction of the movement in their tracks, he noticed they mostly appeared to come from a central area, a clear path through the forest. That could be towards the outpost. Slowly, he trudged through the frost towards the only hope he had of living. No longer did he have the energy to jump around and run. Temperatures were dropping rapidly, and the deaths of his teammates were weighing heavily on his heart. He felt numb inside, and it wasn't all from the snow. 1 foot after the other. 1 foot after the other. That was all he had to focus on right now. Was all he could focus on right now. Something broke him out of his almost trance-like level of concentration. Listening intently, he heard the whir of machinery nearby. He stopped moving, hoping his white armor would provide camouflage against the snow. He stood there, stock still, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. Nothing happened. Very slowly, he swiveled his head to the right towards the noise he'd heard. He saw nothing for a moment. Then he spied a very small bit of movement beyond the trees in front of him, large and gray in color. A Titan? From what he'd seen of the battle's aftermath, just about every Titan had been destroyed. Maybe this one had been abandoned early, or had been given orders to hide. He assessed the choices before him. He could continue to trek ahead, with an extremely minute chance of finding the outpost, or he could announce himself to the Titan. Assuming it was IMC, it could help him and potentially guarantee his survival. That is, if he beat the half and half odds first of it being militia. Screw it. Half and half was still better than the shred of luck he had of making it on his own. He changed direction and began to move towards the trees. Upon reaching them, he pushed past the foliage until he stood in a snowy clearing. A Titan of Payne's gray coloration was kneeling in the snow, its back turned to him. He couldn't see what class it was yet, but it seemed to be one of the Atlas derivatives. His boot suddenly made a crunching noise against the frozen ground. He froze, preparing for the Titan to whip around and attack him. But if it took notice of him, it did not show it. Curiosity getting the best of him, he began to make his way around the side of it so he could see the front. It was revealed to be an ion model, and he soon saw why it was kneeling. A single pilot was laid out on the ground in front of it, seemingly wounded. Tobias came to a stop, and his breath caught in his throat as he noticed the brown and green garb of militia adorning the pilot's armor. He looked at the Titan, expecting it to make a move against him now that his own white armor obviously marked him as the enemy. But it seemed completely engrossed with the pilot on the ground's predicament, watching over him in a protective position. Tobias couldn't say what compelled him to inch forward, but he found himself approaching the dying man. He stood over them, watching the rise and fall of their chest as the sound of labored breathing remained ever present. Blood stained the snow around them, casting one spot of imperfection among the pure white. The pilot turned towards the new arrival, and stiffened slightly upon seeing the IMC armor he was wearing. Tobias had a similar reaction as he suddenly realized why he'd felt so drawn to this pilot. He'd subconsciously recognized him. This was the same pilot he'd encountered earlier, the one who'd thrown a grenade at him, and the one he'd shot. In the heat of the moment, he'd only seen the pilot as a threat. That's all that one could afford to see the other side as in this war. But all he felt now was regret. He didn't get any satisfaction out of watching the pilot die. It was just one more death among the already large collection of bodies left in the snow a ways away. He'd had enough of death. Holding his hands up slowly to indicate that he meant the pilot no harm, he observed as the man slowly relaxed and the tension left their body. Through their choked coughs, they looked at Tobias curiously, apparently sizing him up. They beckoned for Tobias to come closer, their hand weakly outstretched towards him. Tobias was still less than comfortable with his current position, but he felt almost obligated to obey, considering he'd been the one to do this. Kneeling down, he gave the pilot one of his hands. Shakily, the pilot pulled Tobias's arm towards their chest, where they'd been shot. In an instant, the palm of his glove was slick with blood. Then the pilot did something unexpected. They moved Tobias's hand away, and this time gripped it with their remaining strength like one would a friend. They held Tobias as an ally for a moment. Tobias was nonplussed by the man's forgiveness. Both of them had lost friends in this battle, but the pilot was willing to put that aside, despite being the only one of the two actually dying. Whether it was from fear of oblivion or simply a lack of other available company, they wanted him at their side for this. He continued to hold the hand of the pilot as their grip slowly became weakened, their fingers slowly loosening from Tobias's grasp. Their breathing became gentler, less labored and choked as it slowed to a crawl. Finally, the strength faded from the pilot's hand, and they breathed their last. Feeling the man's hand go limp in his own, Tobias gave a disheartened sigh. Gently, he placed the pilot's hand over their chest, a respectful position in death. He sat still, just staring at the soldier's form before chancing a glance upward. His eyes met the Titan's optic, bright blue and glaring at him. Upon the severity of the situation hitting him, he began to back away slowly. It followed his movements until he was roughly 3 meters away, and then turned back to the dead pilot. Its dead pilot. Any hope he had of making it out of this alive deflated instantly. He certainly couldn't outrun a Titan, and it'd probably just shoot him if he started it and tried anyway. There was no way out of this situation. He was stuck in the snow with a dead militia pilot, one whose Titan almost certainly wanted revenge. He sat down hard in the snow, for once ignoring his fight-or-flight response. If he was going to die, he was going to go out with dignity and not with cowardice. They both rested there in the cold, the air chilling each of them to the core. Minutes passed on in silence as man and machine waited on the other. "Why do you not run?" Tobias looked up at the metal being. It had spoken with a distinctly feminine voice, one that had not phrased the question as a suggestion, but more like a passing curiosity that needed answering. He blinked in disbelief before shrugging. "There's no way I can outrun you, and I certainly can't overpower you. Why die tired?" The Titan did not speak. He waited a few seconds before returning to staring at the snow and trying to remain warm. "You accept death as an inevitable outcome?" He looked back up again. "I mean, it's pretty black and white. If I stay here, I freeze to death. If I leave, you kill me. Seems inevitable from where I'm sitting." Her chassis listed slightly, as if contemplating his answer. "I have no intention of killing you." That surprised him immensely. Not that I'm complaining, but why not? "My pilot is dead. I desired a different outcome, but killing you does not grant one." She paused, thoughtfully phrasing her next words. "There has been enough death today." To his astonishment, it seemed as though the Titan shared the same frame of mind that he had. That doesn't sound like something most Titans would say. She was silent before turning back to the pilot's body. "I'm not most Titans." Another pause. The wind and snowfall were beginning to intensify, a warning of the imminent storm. "He was your enemy. Most people would have left him there without a second thought. Yet you made the effort to comfort him, even showed him respect in death. Why?" He reflected on his own past and the reasons he had for doing what he did. "I'm not most people." During each of the silences that followed their discourse, they did nothing but simply stare at the other. Despite what they'd both said, each expected the other to turn on them at any moment. Eventually, the Titan decided to concede. "Continue northeast. There is an outpost you can use for shelter, but you must hurry before nightfall." Then, she became quiet once more and returned to mourning her pilot. He wasn't about to waste the opportunity to leave if the Titan was truly letting him go. He stood up quickly, brushing snow off of his armor as he did so, and began to head back towards the clearing. But her wording seemed odd for some reason. A thought struck his mind and made him hesitate. "Aren't you going to get out of the storm too?" She kept her back to him. "No." "Why not?" "My chassis sustained heavy damage. Its systems have insufficient power." He looked over her form and noticed several components on her back and joints sporting that damage she'd spoken of. He could see coolant leaking from a panel near the top, a sign of a damaged battery. There was no way that she was going to be traveling anywhere soon with a broken case like that, and her servos and motors would freeze if she remained out here. Best case scenario, she'd be trapped out in the snow indefinitely until she self-terminated. He debated with himself over what to do. Realistically speaking, he had no obligation to help her. As unusual as she was still the enemy. Hell, he'd thought she was going to kill him up until a few minutes ago, but she didn't. "He was your enemy. Most people would have left him there without a second thought. Yet you made the effort to comfort him, even showed him respect in death. Why? I'm not most people." Was he going to live up to what he'd told her? Or was he going to prove her right? With a tired groan, he began to head back towards the scarred battlefield instead of the clearing. He stepped carefully, looking through the remnants of what had once been a beautiful image of serenity. The damage done to it was just one small testament to the battle that had occurred shortly before. Looking over the field, he noticed something, a potential target. Increasing his speed, he came across the carcass of a fallen Titan, IMC. He recognized it as Josper's, a Legion model named CO4057. Obviously, neither Josper nor CO4057 would be needing what he was after. Making his way to the back of the dead Titan, he unsheathed his data knife and began to pry open the back panel. After a few tries of bending the weakened metal, the cover popped off and allowed access to the battery within. He felt a sense of satisfaction upon seeing that the battery's casing wasn't damaged. The Titan's data core and internal hardware had been shot to hell, but at least the power supply had survived. Hefting the heavy cylinder in his left hand, he turned around and headed back the way he came. When he arrived, the Titan was still there, kneeling near the body in the same position her chassis had locked up in. He walked forward with confidence this time, now that she'd gone into a standby mode. Maneuvering behind her, he climbed atop her back up to where the damaged battery was located. Her panel opened easily enough, and the damaged battery slid out, its casing cracked and dripping the same coolant he'd spotted earlier. Throwing it aside onto the snow, he twisted and pushed the new battery into the receptacle. The reaction was immediate. The Titan jolted back into motion and stood up, the movement throwing Tobias off and into a bank of snow. Startled at being reactivated, the Titan looked at her arms, testing out her newfound mobility. She nudged her legs, responsive and ready. She swung her body around to stare at him, and he froze momentarily as the thought of her crushing him once again became prevalent in his mind. Her optic glared almost accusingly at him. "What did you do?" Once he was reasonably sure she wasn't going to obliterate him, he stood back up and dusted the white fluff off of his armor. "I found a battery from one of our dead Titans. Your own battery's casing was leaking, so I replaced it with the new one. It doesn't cover all of the repairs needed to get you back into fighting shape, but it should get you moving again." She stared at him blankly. She clearly had not thought that he'd go so far as to help her when she'd given him an easy escape. He felt a bit put off by the scrutiny. "Look, like you said, there's been enough death for one day. You gave me a chance to live, so I repaid the favor and gave you the same." He dismissed her reservations and continued sarcastically, "Besides, we're still stuck here. Figured each of us could use the company." She held his gaze for a few more seconds before shifting from one foot to the other. "Perhaps not." He tilted his head in confusion as she looked back towards the direction of the clearing. "There's a satellite dish back at the outpost. We were in the process of repairing it from environmental damage when the IMC attacked. I can send a distress signal to M-Corps forces and request extraction, but you'll be required to perform the repairs." Tobias crossed his arms at the new information. "Forgot to mention that when you sent me off, huh?" "It requires access to militia-coded communications for use." The lens shutter over her optic closed slightly, giving it the appearance of someone narrowing their eyes shrewdly. "I have no desire to kill you. That does not mean I trust you. You are still IMC and responsible for the deaths of Captain Shears as well as numerous militia combatants." At the mention of her dead pilot, Tobias felt another pang of regret. Still, he couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment when it came to surviving this ordeal. "So, why help me at all? How do I know you won't just kill me the moment I've got the relay working?" "To get the relay working, I require your assistance. To call for extraction, you require my communication codes. Each of us must rely on the other for survival, and so I am forced to put my trust in you. I ask that you do the same for me." He crossed his arms. "Trust you? Trust me." Every instinct in his body was telling him not to. The militia was not to be trusted. They were nothing more than pirates and terrorists, tearing apart the frontier while claiming it was for the good of all. He wasn't sure he could ally himself with any ideal that valued chaos over peace. Then again, she wasn't asking him to trust the militia, just her. She made one final statement. "It's your only chance to survive and get off this planet." He sighed in resignation. "Northeast, right?"